My name is Kimmo Forss. I'm a worldwide community director within the consulting organization at Microsoft. The reason why I'm here is I've just finished a complex migration project where we were moving our enterprise services organization's knowledge repository into the cloud. So I'll share all about the gruesome details. I'm actually 19 years old, but that project has been so heavy. How I wanted to actually start this, I wanted to talk a bit about the role of SharePoint for us as Microsoft in the company. What our footprint was, what is our cloud strategies, what are the processes and tools we're using to move our footprint into the cloud, and why we are doing that. Because our IT, the Microsoft IT department is kind of special. I haven't seen a similar IT department everywhere else because one of our main charters has always been to dog food our products. So we deploy bits that shouldn't go close to production in production. But now with the cloud, it's becoming a bit different because what is production in the cloud, with the cloud ever evolving. So I'll talk about some of the benefits that we are seeing in moving our on-premises footprint into the cloud. I'll also talk about some things that we aren't moving because even though we're cloud, there are still some things that we keep on premises. And I'll talk about the rationale for that. And then I'll end with kind of dissecting through the process in which where we moved a terabyte of content, 37,000 site collections into the cloud. What were the kind of findings we had there, what were the issues that we faced, and all of those things, so that you don't have to have the same problems. So if we go back 4 years in time, so this was what our footprint looked like in 2011. So we had a whole lot of farms. So we had, on each region, we had typically a number of SharePoint farms. We had roughly 240 different type of portals built on top of SharePoint. Most of the key line of business solutions had their own portal. So like the name said, we had HR web for HR solutions, finance, so on and so forth. So we had our own extranet. We had our key intranet portal, MSW, was actually hosted in an on-premises SharePoint environment that was completely managed by the Microsoft IT department. And then we had also roughly 114,000 My Sites span across the different geographies. So it was a pretty large SharePoint footprint, and it was running different versions. So we had like 2010, 2007, so on and so forth. So the thing that then MSIT actually managed here is, so they owned the environments. They were talking with our business groups who kind of had the requirements. So the role of our IT department was kind of to engage with the businesses, to help them to sort of, if the business had a need. So for instance, our HR department, they wanted to have a way whereby they could build their portal to surface the HR information. So we provided them with some level of guidance. And then we actually owned the platform. So all of the servers and all of that thing was managed by MSIT. So underneath that, we had, of course, the usual SharePoint things, search, user profile, social. We actually had and still have a custom taxonomy solution that predates anything that has been in SharePoint. So the way that we do our taxonomies, we actually have a separate solution because that solution provides all the kind of terms and tags to all of the Microsoft properties on the web as well. So, but we actually synchronized that with the term store. So, but again, this was what it looked like for 4 years ago. This is what it looks like today. So most of these self-service type of sites, like collaboration sites, we had 70,000 of them. We're now somewhere around 7,000. So 90% of them we've moved to the cloud. Out of our portals, we started at 240. We have moved 50 of the key portals into the cloud. Then where actually the biggest footprint has been then is all the personal sites and all of those things we've actually moved away from the on-premises environment. So we still have the same kind of for the on-premises environment, we still have the same capabilities with search and all of those things, but now we actually have to have kind of a hybrid setup so that our user profiles, for instance, are in sync with the cloud, our terms are in sync with the cloud, and so on and so forth. So we've actually had to build a number of different tools to sort of make sure that these things sync. So we've been loudly complaining to the engineering groups about the lack of these kind of synchronization capabilities, and we're hoping to see many of these things coming kind of out of the box in 2016, because we all know that the big push for 2016 is actually in the hybrid landscape. So this is a journey that we started some years ago. We're not there yet, but we are on the way. So, and as you could understand, Microsoft is quite a big company with tons of SharePoint stuff. It doesn't happen overnight, but we have clear goals on why we're doing this. And I'll just quickly list some of the reasons why we want to do this. One of the primary reasons is that our IT does not want to manage servers. It's kind of what we want to do is more work with our businesses, kind of aligning on business requirements rather than keeping Exchange servers or SharePoint servers running. So we actually want to move it into a place where IT is more of a service than kind of a facility management type of solution that it oftentimes is today. Also, instead of us in IT or IT department having to implement all the kind of extranet or direct access or VPN capabilities, once we move stuff to the cloud, we get a lot of these things for free. Well, almost for free. It's still quite worse, but we'll get bunch of these capabilities from the service. The technical agility is probably one of the more interesting ones for us, because as with any large organization, procurement costs are typically, or the procurement efficiencies are typically the things that are hindering from elastically scaling your SharePoints. So we had a procurement process that took way too long if we needed new servers. So now with the cloud, since it's semi-automated, that responsibility moves away from our IT, it moves into the engineer group, so to the who are providing this service. Patching, all of those things. So you can imagine having, I don't know, 50, 60 SharePoint farms that we have to patch versus going into the cloud where it's someone else's responsibility. Actually, it's very appealing to the IT departments. And it's kind of funny saying it's someone else, it's still Microsoft, but it's from the IT point of view, it is someone else's responsibility. And then we still want to be the first and best in the sense that we still want to make sure that we are providing feedback to our product groups. And we are doing that. So the Microsoft SharePoint Online tenant is probably bigger than any of the tenants combined out there today. So we have so much stuff. So the farm is just creaking and creaking. So we have people just monitoring that farm to see how big can we scale. So, and that actually has some interesting ramifications, because when we had our traditional portals, we kind of knew in our MSW portal, for instance, we had 4 web front ends. Now, in our portal that's running on SharePoint Online, we have 100. So it actually has impact on your solution design as well, because when you have a limited number of servers, you do things a certain way. Now you can't, for instance, caching typically works well if you have a small number of web front ends, because you're typically hitting the same one with a cache. Now you have 100 that you go across. How does caching work? So a bunch of kind of interesting thing that we learned through the ways. But so why are we then, what are our considerations and goals for doing this? So our ultimate sort of considerations, what we wanted to sort of, before we move properties to the cloud, is we sort of need to understand what they are used for. So the first thing is are there ties to any on-premises systems? So again, we still, as most of our large enterprises, have systems that are not cloud ready, meaning that if you want to integrate with them, you typically have to run inside the firewall. So that's one of the things that kind of was the consideration, which properties should we move. The other one was, where do we have customizations? Because again, we had quite a strict governance process for most parts, but then there were loud business units who wanted something, and typically it's like the cuckoo. It's whomever screams loudest, eventually someone will cave in and yes, we'll allow you to do that. So we still have some customizations that are not really easily migrated to the cloud. So that's one of the considerations. And then we have content where our internal security policies forbid them from moving to the cloud. Not necessarily to the cloud as such, but actually moving them to different geographies. So for instance, we have export regulated content produced in some places where we have factories like China. So there are things that we can't, even though we're an American company, we cannot move them outside the borders of that region. So that's, and this is this is the ultimate trump. If security says no, you can try, but if they ultimately win. It's like planning your vacation with your wife. So I can have ideas, but she makes the calls. Anyway, so. Also, I hope we don't record this. Anyways. So the other one is, so we do have enterprise policies, so we're trying to be a good kind of digital citizens in the sense that we have content types, expiration policies, and all of those things. So for certain content, this is more important than for others. So if it's kind of engineering specifications or if it's kind of anything labor related, the policies are much stricter than it is if you have like open discussions elsewhere. So these things, for that content that we move to the cloud, we still need to be able to apply these policies. And then also, how do we live with hybrid SharePoint? Hybrid has been a pain. And so I guess any one of you who've tried to set up hybrid, it used to be really, really awful. So that's no surprise why we are investing a lot of time in making it work. And the sad thing for me is I actually used to do a lot of Exchange stuff in the past. Exchange hybrid is like, click, you're there. In SharePoint, you go like, and you're not there. You think you're there for a day, and then you're not again. So it's, anyway. So those are kind of the things that we thought about before we decided what goes where. But then our ultimate goals is, again, making sure that we empower our users to get work done, because IT's role is not to manage servers. IT's role is actually making sure that the people find the data, that they're productive. So by moving everything into the same tenant, we actually get the benefit of search then as well, because then it's all spanned in the same corporate search that we had. So we had the same thing in the past, but you had to sort of federate between the different farms. Now that they're all in the same farm, we get much, much easier content discovery. We get consistent employee experience. Consistent doesn't always mean good. So again, because we have one tenant for the entire Microsoft organization. So if you're connected to that tenant via a crappy network line, you'll have a consistently bad experience. But anyway, but again, it's the same thing with anyone who's moving into a centrally managed environment. So network is probably one of the key things. And what we've seen, especially within Microsoft, SharePoint has never been the big problem for us network-wise. Lync has, especially people doing video conferences, all of those. So we've actually invested a lot of time in making sure that our network is link capable, and then therefore SharePoint is typically not a big issue. So, and also ultimately, this kind of protecting the corporate internal assets, which goes close to, so if we get permissions from our security review boards to move content, how can we ensure that it's protected? So what do we then host and where do we host? So again, on premises, we keep content in those regions where we have regulatory reasons. So again, if there's content that you cannot move outside of the borders of the country, we won't. Legacy BI, we are moving more and more of our BI capabilities to Azure and to other kind of a cloud sort of a storage capabilities, but not everything has moved. So there's some BI solutions that we didn't find the ROI for moving them to the cloud yet. So we keep some of the BI capabilities on premises. Complex customizations, again, those ones who we kind of caved in and gave the keys to the kingdom to extend as they wished. Those, we have some of them still running on premises. But again, we are sort of slowly remediating those customizations and then moving content to the cloud. Then the final one here is, within Microsoft, the way that we built our extranet years and years ago was by having an extranet domain in the Microsoft Forest. So whenever you wanted to add an extranet user to Microsoft, you added that user into the extranet domain. So we still have that one in place, but we're trying to move more and more users into the SharePoint Online world where we do partner sharing using the SPO capabilities instead of using our own accounts. So again, but there's still certain kind of partner relationships that we manage. But then in the cloud, in online, the first thing that we moved was the personal sites, so what we now call OneDrive for Business. And the way that we migrated them was very easy. IT gave us an ultimatum. In 6 months' time, we'll close down your My Sites, move your content. So as I said, Microsoft IT is kind of a special organization because they have the authority to make decisions like this. I've tried this with a couple of customers. They go like, no, you can try, but so anyway, so the personal site migration was quite easy for us. We just let the users take care of it. Then the next thing that we've moved is group collaboration and team sites and kind of basic sites where there's very few, if any, customizations. So most of those things we have moved. Where we're now focusing is moving the remainder of our portals, some of our cloud applications, and then some of our extranet solutions. So how long did it take and what did it cost for us? So this is, to me, kind of one of the more interesting slides is you can see the time span. We're talking about 6 years. And even within 6 years, we haven't moved everything. So again, for a large organization, you just don't take everything and just ship it overnight and expect it to be in the cloud. So we started planning this. These are our fiscal years. So roughly like our fiscal year starts at 1st of July. So but roughly the calendar years. We started this in 2012 by kind of laying the foundation for the cloud, to having these things in place. Then we started in 2013 moving the personal sites. I mean, that was when we closed down our existing environments and then started moving the cloud. And then the interesting thing here is that actually the budget goes up then, because again, it costs to migrate. Migration is not free for us because we do assessment work, we do remediation work, we do engineering work. And then in 2014, we actually started to move stuff in bulk. So that was when our migration cost was actually quite higher. But when we started to recoup this on, because we were moving content away, we started to save money by not running those servers. So it kind of stayed roughly flat from 2012. The migration, the labor costs increased, but then the hardware cost shrunk. And then, so that's kind of our projected budgets. So, and I think for most large organizations, it'll be something similar. It costs to get the train moving. And once you then are moving, then you need to be able to sort of recover the cost. And the way that we recover the cost is by making sure that we shut off those servers that we have online. And also the kind of a tricky thing here is that this is actually not just hardware cost, it's also people and engineering support. And what we're doing here is that instead of having people managing servers, we're allowing them to sort of then move up the stack and do something that's kind of more interesting. Of course, there are people who love managing servers. For them, again, we still have some servers, but we won't have as many in the future. So, and I would predict if you look at any large organization doing the migration, you see something similar. So let's actually start to look at in more detail and talk about sorry, if you have any questions, just raise your hand, and because we're not that many, so we can just keep it interactive. So the next thing I wanted, yeah.
Can I ask then, a bit on there, so the on-premise cost reduction, was that simplified just simply because of your massive multiple farm environment, shutting off environments where you've got, say, one production plant with multiple servers?
Yes. Yes. So yeah. So for us, the sheer number of servers moving from hundreds to, let's say, from 500 to 300. So then you get, if it's just like shrinking down your single farm footprints, the savings are probably not that dramatic. But it is actually getting rid of entire SharePoint farms for us. And then especially since we had farms operating in 3 regions, so having that thing, so if we were able to shut down the farms running in Chofu in Japan, we actually didn't need to have sort of people operating them there. So, and then a lot of the engineering costs were actually due to the fact that we didn't really have the right capabilities in the product to support our migrations. We didn't have the right kind of assessment capabilities either. So a lot of if we would do these things once we've shipped 2016, probably the migration costs would be lower, because a lot of the learnings from these large migrations have been fed back to the engineering group so that they've kind of added capabilities into the product to support that. So the migration that I was actually in charge of was what we call Campus. So Campus was the key place for our services organization where we collaborated, supported all our engagements. So our consulting organization, people don't know that we have roughly 21,000 consultants worldwide. So our consulting organization is the largest division within Microsoft. So we actually have 21,000 people in over 100 countries collaborating, working on engagements, sharing data. And the way that we've kind of, from knowledge management point of view, have grouped ourselves is by having what we call communities of practice. So let me see if this, we've had kind of arranged our groups in, each consultant chooses the community of practice that they feel closest to. So we have technical communities, we have architect communities, industry and business communities. And these are, think of these kind of as triangles. So each of these communities are then led by a worldwide lead. We have whose primary role is to coordinate these communities. So making sure that they have monthly meetings, sharing best practices, so on and so forth. Within the community, we have then roughly 1,000 subject matter experts whose role it is to take the learnings that our people create elsewhere and kind of refine it. And then we have 18,000 people who sort of are engaging within these communities. So the migration that we did was actually all the supporting infrastructure that was built to host these things. And our campus was running on premises on SharePoint 2010. We had quite a big farm with then our user acceptance test farms and our developer farms. So one of the other cost savings for MSIT is that for most of our environments, we had multiple environments. So we had the production environment, we had the user acceptance test environment. So actually by getting rid of one environment, we actually got typically rid of 3 farms. So anyway, so this is kind of the landscape for our migration, and the volume that we're talking about is we had roughly 1 terabyte of data. So not huge, but big enough to make it quite complex to move to the cloud. 37,000 collaboration engagement sites, because each of our engagement that we work with customers, our process required that we store these artifacts in SharePoint. So, and again, for any consulting organization, the value for most of them is in the knowledge that they have. So this was a business critical environment for us. We also, to support the communities that I mentioned on the previous slide, had roughly 600 community sites. So we have worldwide communities, but then we have, depending on the area, so we have local communities. So we could have, for instance, an Italian database community who were sharing best practices within that SharePoint site. So these were all in the scope for our migration. We had our central IP repositories with roughly 40,000 IP artifacts that we actually had to move across exactly as they were, but with and maintain all the sort of the metadata fidelity. So who created that document? When was it created? Who rated that document? How was it rated? And so that was kind of the scope. And the process that we used, which is actually a process that I recommend in all migration engagements, is these 4 simple steps, if you may. So we start by an assessment. Again, the reason why we do an assessment is to reduce uncertainty, because I've been doing consulting for many, many years, and like one of my favorite consulting migration moments was I was approached by an account manager for a large US Army division, and she asked me, how much would it cost to move them from system X to SharePoint? And then she stopped. And I was like, okay, any more info? No. But if we win the deal, the Army will make the vendor tell us whatever we want. So again, how on earth was she expecting me to come up with a quote to move from an unknown environment with an unknown amount of data into a known system? So again, that's why like the assessment phase is really, really critical. So that you're reducing the uncertainty so that you actually know what you're talking about. So in our case, for our internal migrations, since we were managing these services, we kind of knew what they had. But what we kind of learned in our process is we've given our people way too much freedom, which means then when we looked and tried to start migrating things, we actually made some interesting discoveries, and I'll share a bit more about them in a short while. So we started with an assessment process where we actually went through, analyzed what we had, so that we can then make data-driven decisions on what to do. The next phase for us was a remediation phase. So typically what these steps usually include is then looking at what the findings in the assessment were, what are the kind of incompatibilities that are hindering you from moving to the cloud. And then you move into the migration phase, and then the last phase is once we migrated, making sure that we do all of the post-migration fix-up, because typically there are things that you have to do. So fixing branding, fixing URLs, this and that. So this is where in most of the migration demos, you will see everything just works great. But then when you grow the scale, so like in our case, even though 1 terabyte doesn't sound like much, but then when we consider what was the average throughput that we're getting, a gig per hour, then it's 1,000 hours plus all the tests and all of that. So it actually quite quickly adds up. So we started the assessment phase, and for us, for the move of campus, we actually only focused on these 4 things because we knew that we were shutting down the old environment, so we actually had to move everything. Or the other option would have been to, well, reach out to the business owners to say, do you want to retain that content or not? And that usually doesn't work well. So I always use this example for talking about kind of this assessment and keeping stuff or getting rid of stuff. We moved apartments with my family 6 years ago. So I was cleaning up the attic in my old place. I found 3 cardboard boxes full with C cassette tapes. So I made the mistake of opening that box. I go, hang on, I still kind of like this band. But I was good. Actually, I got rid of 1 out of 3 boxes. Where are the boxes now? Up in the attic in a new place. I don't even have a cassette tape player. But this is very much what you see when if you start to ask people, can I get rid of this content? Then you go, oh, I might need it. Hang on, it's a Windows NT4 deployment manual. How likely is it that you will need that? So it's troublesome. So for us, and with cloud storage being cheap, so we just decided we'll move everything, because trying to get that cleanup activity is like trying to get my kids to do cleanup without having to whip or forcing them somehow. Anyway, so what we focused on were these things. Getting the URL, because for any cloud migration, typically you're working on either a site or a site collection boundary. So what we wanted to make sure is that we knew the URL to each of these 37,000 site collections. We knew the size of it, because so when we did the kind of migration planning on how many sites do we move per day, that we actually kept it reasonable, so that we weren't trying to one day move two sort of gigs and then the next day 200. So we captured the size, the owner. This was before, because we actually had a process whereby we always notified the user that we are about to migrate your site in 2 weeks' time. And then once we migrated, that we did migrate your site and it's now here. So we had to capture these. We also looked a bit on the customization piece, but in our project, what we decided was that we'll actually start the cloud environment with a clean slate. So rather than trying to port those customizations that were built to meet yesterday's business requirements, we were actually looking at what is it that we're trying to do tomorrow and build the customizations using the cloud principles rather than trying to retrofit what we built 5 years ago. So that was kind of the assessment piece. And then for remediation, for us, it was actually, since we chose to move everything, there was very little content remediation. But typically, what I see happening in this phase in customer projects is actually you can have the discussion with your customer, for instance, like, do you need to keep old versions? So we actually found in some of our sites, like the percentage of content stored in old volumes was ridiculously high because people had by default enabled versioning on everything. So you had a bunch of old goo. So what I recommend if you're doing a migration in your remediation phase, have that discussion. Do I need to retain versions? If you do, when you migrate. If you don't, get rid of them. So I was working with a customer and we had exactly this discussion, and we looked at their data and we found that like if we get rid of 70 of the older versions, your content footprint shrinks with 75%. Let's do that. And then the customer, nope. Why not? And he was, do you know what's our line of business? Not really. I was just told to come here and talk about migrations. So anyway, well, our business is actually to provide maintenance work for nuclear power plants. And we keep all our sort of reports and all our procedures in SharePoint and we version them. So for us, we actually have to take all of versions. So again, typically in the remediation phase, what you should do is have that discussion, and if you can get rid of all versions, please do. If you can't, just make sure that the migration tool or process that you choose to use supports these versions. For customization, for us, it was quite easy because we decided that we will scrap all the customizations because we didn't need to move. Yes?
How did you get rid of the versions? I mean, did you use some custom solutions?
Yes. Yeah. So the question was, how did we get rid of versions? So we had multiple different ways. So we had one way in which you were actually just, we wrote a script that went through and changed the version settings. But then you also have to go and touch that document so that SharePoint will remove those versions. And another option that we used was for if you had an entire site collection or a site where you needed to do that, we actually used the export SPWeb and exported it and then imported it back without versions. So then SharePoint it was kind of an ugly hack to do that, but it worked. So, but customizations can be tricky, and for us, one of the tricky things was that we actually had some farm solutions that had then deployed content types and other artifacts that had then dependencies in the content databases. So what we needed to do then in our case is, in our migration, we actually also did an information architecture rewrite in the sense that we changed the content types, we changed the metadata for our documents, because we made the mistake when we designed the first version of Campus. We were saying that, well, for each document, you must fill in these 15 metadata fields so that we get perfect knowledge management. And of course, the users hated it. So, and we also made the other mistake of having default values in those. And what does that mean? Then every document is there with the freaking default values. So what we decided to do in our new environment is that for basic content, we're actually not enforcing much, if any, metadata. But then, so the way that we have our intellectual property grouped within the consulting organizations, we have a pyramid where on the base is what we call individual IP. There we don't require metadata. But then if you move up the pyramid into what we call community shared IP or community IP, then we start to require that you add some metadata so that it's discoverable. And then when you move to the upper part of the pyramid, then we actually have quite rigorous metadata requirements. And that actually works quite well, because those persons who think that their content is valuable for reuse, they usually are okay in providing that metadata. But so, whereas end users aren't necessarily. So the migration for us was a three-step process. So since we were running 2010, and since we were actually changing information architecture on the fly, we built a three-step process, and it was actually fully automated. So you're looking at the sole resource for doing that migration, so everything was fully automated. So because we had, our ambitious goal was to see if we can actually use something that we could eventually turn into a factory type of model where we could automate kind of the 90% of the migration scenarios easily. So our process had three steps. We exported the content from the 2010 environment. We created the sites on SharePoint Online, and then we imported the content. And everything was scripted, so there were just scheduled tasks running and doing these tasks. So the process itself, this kind of shows all the steps. And if you remember what I said in the assessment phase, we were capturing the owner information. This is because 2 weeks before any migration, we actually send emails to the people who are whose sites are being migrated 2 weeks times, that your site is about to be migrated, so that they had an option to do an opt-out. So if there's something happening that we don't know about, that says that we can't do the migration. So our process starts by 2 weeks before the migration. We will notify the site owners, and then after 2 weeks time, we start the export process. We're exporting the content from the 2010 environment, and at the same time, we're marking that site collection as read-only, because we didn't want to be in the place where we actually had to do incremental migrations. So we did it for some sites, and I'll come back to them in a short while. So we exported the content. We then had a job that went and created sites on SharePoint Online. So the other thing that we decided to do is, instead of us moving 37,000 site collections into 37,000 site collections in the cloud, we actually said that, well, we'll take those 37,000 site collections and we'll distribute them across 100 site collections in SharePoint Online. This is the primary reason for us was our sites were small, so we didn't, and our SharePoint Online farm for Microsoft is so big, so we didn't want to add a burden of 37,000 site collections, because that has an impact on the config database. So, and also a lot of the stuff that we do governance-wise are actually on site collection owners and site collection boundaries. So by us taking the ownership of those 120 root site collections, we took the kind of management overhead. So whenever MSIT, Microsoft IT, sends mails that you need to do something, it comes to our team, rather than to our end users who would be clueless about what we expect from them. So that's why we have the process that goes and creates those sites. And then we start migrating the content. That's step number 4. And then in the 5th step, once the migration is completed, we'll then notify the user that your site has been migrated. This was the old URL, this is the new URL. So in order to help the transition, so we own this environment, so we actually could deploy stuff into it. So we had custom commandlets deployed here for providing kind of the export capabilities. We also built an ISAPI filter to help in the case that if someone is navigating the old URL, we'll take them to a redirect page saying that your site is now here. And we could have done this automatically, but we decided not to, because if it would have been automatic, then people would never go and update their bookmarks. So we kind of told them that this is the page, boom, and then eventually we will retire this. So also we had the migration workstations that were, in essence, they were just desktop machines, not necessarily even server machines. The only thing that we had to have there is our custom commandlets deployed, and then this task scheduler running, and it just was then sort of coordinating the whole thing. And the way that the process behind the scenes worked, that each of the kind of migration activity, the export, the site creation, and the import had it talked to the same pipeline, and that pipeline was actually implemented in SQL. So we had all of the URLs, if you may, for all the sites, all the owners in one SQL table. In the same table, we had the destination URL and the directory name into which we sort of exported the content. So all the logic was there. These are the scheduling principles we used. Maximum 20 gigs per day. We could have gone higher, but we didn't have an ambitious timeline because we didn't need to. So we actually wanted to play it safe because we didn't really know how it would work out. So we said maximum 20 gigs per day, maximum 250 site collections per day. And also, since we had this in SQL, we built a simple dashboard. So whenever you get the mail sent to the user that your site is about to be migrated, like let's say 1st of May, then the user could go in and opt out and say, hang on, actually, can you move me the 2nd of May instead? So we provided this capability. Out of the 37,000 sites, 5 people used that. Question?
How long it took to migrate one site?
That's a tricky question because it's like how long is a piece of rope. So because it depends on the size. So what we saw typically was the throughput was roughly a gig per hour plus, but what actually surprised us most was if you had large lists with a large number of items, because when you move stuff to the cloud, each is a transaction. So actually moving a file or creating a list item was roughly the same overhead. So we were surprised. We had some sites with a really large number of lists, and they took really, really long time. And then the number of metadata you had per column, so it was a mix. So for us, what we had in the environment, we had 5 types of site collections. We had what we call collaboration sites and engagement sites. The ones that are closed means that like typically people aren't accessing anymore because the engagement is closed or the project is closed. Those we actually were migrating 24/7. We just had dedicated machines running because no one was really accessing them. The ones that were active, either collaboration or engagement sites, those we did like engagement sites weekends only, collaboration sites weekday only. And it was only these sites that we actually notified the user, because we knew that if we tell the people about their closed sites, they would just be confused. So to support this, we actually had a Yammer group that we had as part of all the messaging. If you have any questions, this is the Yammer group. So we were testing out if Yammer would work as a help desk in a case like this, and it kind of worked. But the problem that we saw is that we had hope that people would read through the Yammer if someone had already asked the question. No. So people were like, I have a question, I ask it. So you could have done page down, there was that question, but people don't do that. So that was kind of an interesting lesson learned. So the other benefit then, we had everything in SQL. Then it was so easy to just do Excel reporting. So we had a live dashboard just showing that out of these sites, how many sites have been imported, what's the error rate, and so on and so forth. So this is what allowed us actually to have a team of 1 to do this, because we sort of, it was on, with 2020 hindsight, it was silly of me to agree to do it that way, but it felt good at that time, so it was a fun ride. So the timelines for us, so, sorry? It wouldn't have been much different because it's the same concept. So the challenge that we had was more on the stability of the Microsoft's tenant, because as I said, it's so big. And then so we had to make sure that the migration tool was resilient enough, because the key assumption that we made that is migrations will fail. And we wanted to make sure that everything that we wrote are re-entrant in a way that I can pick up and resume where it crashed. So this is kind of the timeline for us. So the IP libraries, we were running from July until January. We did all the migrations in the first 2 weeks, but then since this was live on the old environment, so we had incremental migrations happening for these IP libraries. And our incremental migration was that for every day we just asked, which are the documents that have been modified in the last 24 hours? And it works well for documents because the file name is kind of, or the URL is unique. For list items, that wouldn't have worked. So engagement sites started in August, they were done by October, engagement sites. So this is kind of the timeline. And then we did the final community sites in January this year. So it didn't take really that long, but again, we weren't trying to push the envelope. So we had kind of a set timelines that were reasonable, and we also knew that there are things that will fail. So we didn't have the urgency of getting everything done. So as part of the process, then we had kind of defined the quality gates. So our goal was to ensure, well, all content or kind of the content that we migrated is good enough. Because one of the challenges we had is that in the old environment, we had our own term store. And our knowledge management solution for services has been around for 10 years. So in our taxonomy, we had like Windows 2000 deployment guides and stuff like that, which don't exist in the new corporate taxonomy anymore because those are retired. So we knew that we couldn't move everything, but so the goal for our quality assurance was that is the data of good enough quality? So there were some cases where we had issues, for instance, with the thing that was most difficult was lookup lists, when people had built complex lookup hierarchies. So if you have a lookup list, you need to migrate the list that you're looking from first. But then we had document libraries that had lookups to itself. And then that was an interesting challenge, I have to say. So the criteria for us, no items missing, metadata is correct enough, the site hierarchies, and access is retained. So one of the challenges we had also here was that we don't synchronize all of the AD groups that we have in Microsoft into SharePoint Online. So if we had secured access to content using some of those groups that don't exist in the cloud, we had a bunch of kind of orphan sites or actually sites that no one had access to except the migration account. So that was some of the things that we had to make sure that we then addressed in the post-migration phase. Branding piece, again, we have our new kind of branding scheme in the cloud. So for those sites where we actually did UX type of migration, we sometimes had to go in and kind of maybe reapply the master page or stuff like that. But that was actually very few sites. Security was probably the toughest one, because then the way that we did that was simply by, since we knew the URLs to both sites, we just appended the _layouts then to the user ASPX page, and then had in Excel 2 links in an Excel spreadsheet, gave our operations team start clicking and see what's different. Because if you do it that way, the eye can actually quite quickly see that they don't look alike. So we actually were toying with the idea of automating that. We're actually doing an HTTP GET for those pages and putting in 2 columns in Excel, so do it visual, but we didn't have time to do that. So there were some kind of manual steps. The link fix-up is probably the trickiest one, because what we did there is, so we had the ISAPI filter that did the redirects for the 2010 environment, but all the links in emails, in Office documents, those will break eventually. So again, this is kind of an expectation setting, is you will have people who say that I can't find my content anymore. And then the end user notification, making sure that people know that their site is migrated. So from the tooling point of view, we had quite specific requirements, so we couldn't find a tool that could meet all our requirements. Therefore, I volunteered to write one, which is, well, it's fun, right? But anyway, so because we had strict requirements, so we were changing the information architecture from site collection to subsites. We were changing taxonomies, we were changing metadata, and what makes it even more complex was that our team doesn't have term store permissions, so we can't add our own terms. So we have to go via a change management process to get these things in place. So anyway, so we had to make sure that the tool that we built had term mapping capabilities. So my old term X had a GUID of Y, now it needs to have a GUID of Z. So we had those things and did that dynamically. All the things we wrote were implemented as custom PowerShell commandlets. So the on-premises migration tools were using the server-side object model because we deployed them to that environment. Then the cloud components were using CSAM or web services to talk to SharePoint Online. And the brain was SQL. So in essence, like the beauty of this all was scheduling was with that one table in SQL. And there was one simple version of the truth. Any error in any other components, in the export, the site creation, or import, was stored in that SQL table. So that's why after I had my morning coffee, I opened SQL Explorer, started looking, were there any errors? If there were any errors, then the easiest thing was just to sort of flip the date one day ahead so that they would be migrated the next day. And the typical errors that we saw were ADFS related, so authentication hiccups, or 503s, which means that we were having, SharePoint had its kind of a grumpy mood, said that I'm not allowing you to do things. So, but those were the typical, very few other errors. And then, and for our engagement sites, this was typically not a big problem because they were typically small with 20 to 50 documents. But for our managed IP libraries with 20,000 documents, it was a more tricky thing, especially because we had really deep nested hierarchies. So if the import crashed somewhere deep in the heart, where did it crash? How can I pick up and resume? So that was kind of some of the interesting things that we had to build. And the things that we built was the HTTP module I mentioned. So this was deployed on the SharePoint 2010 environment so that it could actually capture all the requests coming into it. The dispatcher, so we actually had, since all the information was in SQL, we just had simple commandlets saying that, give me all the closed engagement sites for this day. And then, boom, you got a list of, you got an object array with URLs. And the site provision, I mentioned already this, that we had a round robin logic where we were saying that instead of sort of doing like filling up one site collection, we did a round robin. The problem with the round robin approach was that we didn't really know that we were filling them evenly. So we got an even number of sites that we didn't know the size. But we actually, in our tenant now, all the site collections have a 1 terabyte quota, so it wasn't a problem for us anymore. So the export one, so again, a commandlet that exported the content into XML and files. The reason why the documented XML helped us was because we actually not only moved site collections into subsites, we also moved some of the document libraries into subfolders in the documents library. And we did that primarily so that people could use OneDrive Sync and sync just one document library with the folders instead of having to sync 3 document libraries. So the import piece, again, he was using CSAM to provision the sites, the lists, the libraries, content types, users, and all of that. And then the dashboard. The dashboard was kind of an afterthought where we realized that since we have that data in SQL, wouldn't it make sense to surface that so that we would always know where we are? So some of the lessons learned in this project, prepare for exceptions. So there's things that happen. So when we migrated the content, we discovered that some of the, for instance, Microsoft Consulting Services in Russia had built their billing system using InfoPath on campus. None of us knew that. And then suddenly their business manager said, hey, we can't do invoicing because the InfoPath forms aren't there. And we went, hang on, you did what? So that was kind of an interesting finding that don't expect to know what's in your environment, especially if you're giving people enough freedom to do things. Large lists. So what we saw, since in CSAM, each import of an item is a transaction. So if you have a large list, it takes a long time to get through it, even though it has very few gigabytes of content or megabytes of content. Wide lists. This was a problem for 2 reasons. One of the main reasons was that we have a web application policy on SharePoint Online that limits the number of, for instance, lookup columns that you can have in any library or list. And the other impact with that wide list was that, so the maximum number of lookup columns that the OneDrive Sync client supports is 12. So if you go above 12, then you start getting, that's one of the reasons why you're starting to get sync errors in OneDrive. But we planned our information architecture so that we had maximum of 12. But what we did not know at that time was that whenever you share a document using like the share with capability, then SharePoint adds a column into that list, which adds another lookup column. So we had then sites that were working, sites that weren't working. Then we had even a site that was working for some person but not for the other person. That's when we discovered that the Groove client actually caches the schema. So it kept on working for a while. So it wasn't. So wide lists caused us a lot of grief. Then communications, again, I can't stress that enough. So make sure that people know what's going on. And so I would encourage you to send too many emails rather than too few. There will be people who complain about getting too much, but if you don't send them, there will be more people more angry that they didn't know about things. So, and also communications internal within the team. So this was in January, we were 2 weeks before we were said that this migration is done, then there's only one thing left to migrate. And what's that? Well, it's the campus wikis. So wikis, those are easy. They're just like HTML, whatnot. They were called campus wikis. They were actually a full-blown web content management solution. So suddenly, we had 2 weeks' time, had to implement support for page layouts, for master pages, and all of that. So again, communications, making sure that you communicate to your end users, that you have the right communications within the team. So then, kind of to summarize what we kind of learned as what are the keys to success for any migration. Again, making sure that you have people who know the source. I just put System X because this applies for anything. In our case, having someone who knows what we had on campus. We thought we did, but when we did the migration, we realized that we had these billing systems, we had some other kind of a funky systems being built by power users who had enough permissions. Having someone who knows the target environment. So what are the differences, let's say, from a content point of view if you compare on-premises and SharePoint Online? Luckily, there aren't that many, but like the wide list one is a typical one, and then some of the other kind of can be more kind of permissions related. Make sure that you have someone who has at least a basic understanding of development. It could be just writing scripts or something, but someone who can, if you do remediation activities or if you do assessment activities, that you can do them programmatically or by scripts, because the benefit of doing things with scripts, it fails the same way. So that's kind of the iterative process. You fail until you succeed. If you have people doing something via the UI, next time they do it, they forget something. So again, have some level of development skills within the project team. Knowledge management, this is an optional, but I do encourage you to sort of think about how to structure the data. So another kind of a personal life experience of moving and structuring data. So I've been in so many IT conferences. You can imagine the number of conference t-shirts I have at home. So this was when we were moving. So I actually found a really weird secret with all conference t-shirts. You put them in a dark cupboard for a long time, you know what happens? They shrink. So knowing how to then moving stuff across and making sure that you sort of take the right data and put it in the right place. So the realistic timelines, again, don't be too ambitious, because most people, like the biggest problem I've seen with most migration projects is that if the person who's proposing a migration kind of says, we can do it by X, rather than saying, hey, when do you need to have it migrated? Are there any compelling events that drive your timelines? So we have a customer that we're working with a OneDrive for business migration, and they want to get rid of their file shares, and they have a compelling event at the end of June. They need to renew the contract. So we have to be migrated by then. But if you don't have a compelling event that forces your timelines, leave enough room so that you have time to do it right. The commitment, again, making sure that you have a strong enough steering committee who can then make the call that, okay, these things are out of scope. We'll face the wrath of our end users because we couldn't do this. Because you have to have someone who has the authority to, it could either be to say, well, hang on, so let's actually give the project 3 more months of time. So, because the worst thing is actually trying to operate in a position where you don't have a way to be successful because you don't have the full support from higher up. And with that, we have 1 minute to go. Thanks for being here.